Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook, and this is segment 2 of the discussions pertaining to campaign finance reform. With me again today are Eitan, Fenson. Did I say it right that time?
Eitan.
Eitan. I always want to see Eitan. Okay, Eitan, Fenson, and Graig. I can't read my handwriting here. Dunkerley.
Dunkerley, you got it.
Graig Dunkerley. Unfortunately, Selena Graig was unable to join us for this second segment. She has some pressing obligations she had to go take care of, so she's not with us on Skype today. But we're going to come back to this discussion that we were having about the problem of, let's see, how do I state this? The corrupting influence of money in our current political system. And I want to address this from two different sides. And we'll go at one and then we'll go at the other. And the two I want to address have to do with, first, the elected official, whether it be national, state, local level. And then secondly, I want to take a look at the ballot measures in a state and local contest that one has to vote on, tax raising, whatever it happens to be, zoning laws,
Prop 49,
GMOs,
Prop
whatever.
49.
Okay.
Prop 49.
So I want to talk about those two things, but I want to start with going back to this primary discussion about elected officials and how we find a way to unburden them from the requirement of spending so much of their time and energy and integrity finding the money to be able to run for re-election. So where do we start with that?
I think we found the answer a long time ago, and it's a public financing of campaigns. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has made it more difficult to construct a public financing system that works best, but we can still do it. Even under the current Supreme Court strictures, we can come up with a public financing system. The basic idea being that if the money to fund a campaign comes from an impartial public source, then the corruptive influence of that money goes away. It's not the money itself that corrupts the politics, it's the source of the money and the motivation for it being given.
There's going to be costs associated with running a campaign. You have to print up flyers, you have to buy TV time, whatever it's going to be. Okay, you have to have X number of people helping you run the campaign. So it's not that there isn't money that's necessary.
Yeah.
It becomes a question of how it's spent, et cetera, et cetera. And I can appreciate the concept of where it comes from as well.
And how much time the candidate has to spend getting it.
Right. I had heard, and I think it was one of you two gentlemen had mentioned to me when we were on a phone conversation, that there are a couple of states that had utilized this public financing concept to some level of success.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, do you want to?
Well, I was actually going to throw a little bit of a wet blanket on it all.
Well, before you do that, let me talk about the ones that have worked really well. Maine was the first one to come up with a really effective public financing system at the state level. At the federal level, we came up with a very effective public financing system for presidential elections in the late 70s after the Watergate era as part of the reform movement that came with that. And presidential candidates from then until the early 2000s never had to spend their time raising money. The money came from an impartial public fund. People may remember the little checkbox, which is still there on your income tax return, that says check this box if you'd like $3 of your taxes to go to fund that thing. So it's one of the neat things about public financing of campaigns is it's unbelievably cheap. It's not expensive at all. And the reason is because there's so many of us. That's the one big advantage that we have in this democracy over the big corporations and other wealthy special interest groups is they've got a lot of money, we've got a lot of us. The problem is we're not real organized and we're not all moving together, which is why programs like this, are hopefully helping to educate people and let them know that there are solutions to these problems. We just have to get together and implement them.
So let's get the blanket.
Now the wet blanket.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that there are ways to publicly finance elections. I believe the Supreme Court will make it impossible for that to be the only way that the elections are financed, because, according to Buckley versus Vallejo, you cannot prevent an individual from spending as much money as they want on an election.
Nor should you, if it's an individual, I think. However, you said something in the last episode that makes a lot of sense to me, and that was the move to amend concept of a corporation not being a person.
Yes, but there's the other piece of it as well, which is that we believe
Money is not speech.
an individual should not have the right to spend unlimited amounts of money on any form of speech. In fact, I had a very interesting conversation with our local county supervisor about this issue. And he's very concerned about the phenomenon of too much speech by one individual or one group drowning out the speech of everyone else.
Yeah.
So the First Amendment, when it protects speech, it also should protect the speech of all of us who are being drowned out by the person with the megaphone. So for example...
And that's not just with respect to money, but that happens in a lot of different scenarios.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. But the bottom line here is that the Supreme Court has already ruled in the case of publicly financed elections that you cannot restrict an individual from jumping in and adding more money to an election campaign. The Supreme Court has ruled that. Now, who knows? Maybe ultimately when we have a new Supreme Court, they may change their minds.
Right.
But currently that means that publicly financed elections fly in the face of the constitutional right to spend money, unlimited money, on elections.
So that kind of implies that it's an either-or proposition. Either you have public financing or you...
Eitan is right, but I'm going to say that it's not quite as bad as it might sound. Arizona and Maine had extremely good public financing systems. They worked really well. About 6 or 8 years after they developed theirs, Connecticut came on board with theirs. Also works really well. Then, even with Buckley-Vallejo being in force at the time, but then these more recent decisions, Bellotti versus First National Bank of Boston and McCutcheon and Citizens United, have made it much more difficult, and a decision I think that you're relating to, Eitan, where the court, one of the key factors of the public financing system that made it work really well was that if the publicly funded candidate, the one who voluntarily said, I won't take any special interest money from anybody, I'll just use the money in the public fund, which is limited, and I'll limit all my spending to just that. If that candidate were to be outspent by a privately funded candidate who opted out and could raise all the money they wanted, the Arizona and Maine systems and Connecticut had a what they call a matching funds provision, where they keep track, the state keeps track of how much money that other privately funded candidate is spending, and if and when it exceeds the amount of money that was given to the publicly funded candidate, the publicly funded candidate is giving matching funds, dollar for dollar, up to a limit. We don't want to break the bank.
Sure.
But we also discovered that you don't have to match dollar for dollar forever. You just have to give that publicly funded candidate enough money so that they can get their message out and not be at a disadvantage. Now,
there were a couple of things that happened recently in elections where the candidate who didn't have the most money back east somewhere won, and so I can appreciate, and it's clear to me how the availability of the money creates an opportunity to broadcast this message more constantly. And the unfortunate thing about messages being broadcast constantly, it's like any kind of propaganda. If you hear it enough times, you begin to believe that it's true, whether it's true or not. And that happens as far as who the guy running for election is, a guy or gal running for election, or whether it's a proposition, whatever number, one side or the other. So there has to be, I would think, some kind of parity in terms of the ability to communicate your message to a hopefully intelligent electorate that will be able to make an informed decision. But we're not there. We're not anywhere near there.
Among the things that you could do once we pass a constitutional amendment that says that money's not speech,
Right.
and that corporations are artificial entities. We don't want to pick on corporations. Artificial entities are not people. Among the many things you could do is you could start regulating the length of campaigns.
Correct.
You could start regulating how much money anybody spends. You could start providing for a free or very nominally priced airtime so that campaigns weren't so expensive in the first place. There would be all kinds of things that you could do that would be in the public interest, that would make campaigns be more functional, or our whole democracy more functional, and that would allow the democracy to function in the public interest. But we have to, since our current Supreme Court, is kind of gone off the rails here, we're going to have to either get a different Supreme Court makeup, or we're going to have to amend the Constitution so that's no longer a problem.
Just a question
I
for
agree
my,
with Graig.
for my, you agree with, I like that, that's good. The blanket has been removed. So,
And you can still do public financing, but it's much harder to do it and have it be effective now because of these recent Supreme Court
right,
decisions.
and I actually wanted to ask a question about that, because I'm not as conversant on these Supreme Court decisions. I know that I did read in the papers in the last several weeks about one or two things that they did, but you mentioned about 4 or 5 different decisions. And my question is, were all those decisions set down by the current makeup of the Supreme Court, the justices that are there today?
No.
No. Okay.
So go back to Buckley versus Vallejo, which is, in a sense, really it corresponds with the beginning of this trend. This is 1976. It was the Burger Court. So it was not the current makeup of the court. It had a conservative majority appointed by a Republican president, but it wasn't as extreme, we'll say, as the current court. And that issue about equating spending of money versus the exercise of free speech, that's a dicey issue. It's not something that's obvious. I was a graduate student at the time, and I remember thinking to myself, there was an element that kind of was consistent with our capitalist system, that the notion of money and speech being equivalent was a natural outgrowth of our capitalist system. Over time, I've learned some. I've gotten more experience and maturity, and I believe that it isn't necessarily an outgrowth of our capitalist system anymore. The point being that back in 1976, they were blazing new territory, that it was a much more, it was just a very simple statement, money and speech. And as things have progressed, as the court has become more fractious, you get into things that are, as John Paul Stevens claims, are ludicrous. At least that's the way I believe. But the other decision, I just wanted to get back to what Graig was saying, the matching funds, that's really what I was talking about. The court said that you cannot do matching funds, that you can't compensate for overspending by an opponent through public funds. That's why I believe, and Move to Amend believes, and I'm representing Move to Amend, the only way to deal with this is to instruct the Supreme Court in no uncertain terms. You don't have a choice. The Constitution says spending money is not the exercise of free speech.
And I can see how that makes a lot of sense in a political perspective. I mean, I've been in, from a business career perspective. If you want to get your product out there, you want to beat the competition. You spend whatever you spend a lot of money, and sometimes you have to spend more money. And if it's money well spent, then you get more sales and all that sort of thing. But in the realm of elected officials, and I think in the realm of ballot measures, there's a potential problem with that.
Right.
It's a different world.
That's
It's not the world of can I sell my widget all over the world and make money on my widget because that's what I'm in business for. Because you shouldn't be in business to get somebody elected president or congressman or whatever. But the point is, I think, that becomes part of the business of business because it impacts the tax laws potentially. Right?
Absolutely, but it's worse than that because it even gets into selling widgets. suppose you have a large multinational corporation that can spend an awful lot of money hiring people to write laws, which happens. And suppose you end up with a law that basically gives one set of competitors an advantage in the way that they sell their widgets. That is not in the interest of competition.
No, not at all.
But it is what happens. So, in fact, one of the tenets of Move to Amend is, and I have to say, I'm a corporate CEO. I've been a corporate person for 30 years. Most corporate people do not like the notion of corporate personhood because what it does is it gives advantages to the big guys, to squelch the innovators, the smaller businesses. So it seems to us...
Because what they will do is they will use, this is my constitutional right type
That's
thing.
right.
As opposed to, I mean, if you're infringing on somebody's patent, that's one thing.
Right.
But if you're,
That's
okay,
right.
I get it.
And by the way, patents are in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Corporate rights are not.
Corporate. I like to say, I have nothing against corporations. Corporations do a lot of good things. They create jobs. They're arguably an effective way to organize business and various kinds of manufacturing and the provision of all kinds of services. I just don't want them running my government.
Right.
Right.
No, which is reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's not what that concept of a corporation running a government is not the first time it's happened, right? The Dutch East India Company.
They had a parallel government.
Yeah, the British had their thing. You know? So it's not like it hasn't happened. But I think what the challenge is that when things are going well as a society, things are going well. Stuff happens, but it was going okay. I can still get my kids going to college, and I own my house, and I have some money in the bank, and blah 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 blah. These little tweaks that are happening that you're not really paying attention to, all of a sudden you've created a monster has been created. That's that correct. You don't recognize has been created.
Let me just point out a little irony here. You mentioned the British East India Company. Well, it's no coincidence that the framers of the Constitution did not include anything on corporations in the Constitution. They did so because they were very, very fearful of corporations. They wanted to make sure that they didn't get any special treatment in the Constitution, in particular the British East India Company. The Tea Party, who was that against?
Yeah, right.
So the point is that it is quite ironic that the strict constructionists of our society are now advocating decisions that really fly blatantly in the face of the values of the framers of the Constitution as they put the Constitution together.
Okay, so are we beyond the point of no return?
No, not at all.
Hey.
Because of all the things we've been talking about, there's a lot. We need to come at this problem in a variety of ways. As Selena was saying, there's no silver bullet. I think we're probably going to need to amend the Constitution. That's going to help. And things like public financing of campaigns can still be done, but it's much harder, and you can't construct as effective or efficient a system of public financing as you could if these Supreme Court decisions weren't there.
Or if an amendment to the
Correct.
Constitution is put in place that would facilitate
then that would facilitate it. We could go back to Maine and Arizona. Pretty much had it down. I mean, they had a really great system.
So,
in the meantime, one other thing that we can do while we're working on the constitutional amendment, while we're working on the May Day PAC and trying to get officials elected to Congress that will enact the public financing systems that we can enact. In the meantime, one of the more immediate things we can do is at least let voters know where all the money's coming
Absolutely.
from. Mm-hmm. So, and I think what will happen is what the Disclose Act will do. There's a federal Disclose Act, which this is ironic because in the Citizens United case, only 5 of the justices wrote that decision out of the 9, but 8 out of the 9 agreed that you can require all the disclosure you want of where the money's coming from. You can't limit spending by artificial entities, but you can disclose where the money's coming from all you want. That's perfectly good. In fact, their assumption that that sort of thing was already happening is what was part of their rationale for why it would be okay to let these artificial entities spend all that they wanted. Well, those kind of disclosure laws don't exist. California's gets an A+ rating for their campaign disclosure laws, and California's campaign disclosure laws are pathetic. If you've ever watched the TV,
so they're the best of what's out there, and they're still pretty lousy.
and it's
Right.
pathetic. If you've ever watched a TV ad and try to figure out who paid for it,
Right.
there is a disclosure that, if you can find it, that appears somewhere there
Yeah,
during
it's
the
in
ad.
one point type.
It's all in caps, which is very hard to read. They'll do things like they'll put gray letters on a white background,
Yeah,
make it
yeah.
harder to read. But even if you could freeze frame the thing and get out your magnifying glass, what you're going to probably find out is that the ad was paid for by Citizens for a Better America. I mean, which tells you nothing. It's some misleading name of some
Citizens
Americans
United.
for
Right.
Prosperity, or
Right.
Citizens United, which actually was one of those groups. So what bills like the Disclose Act would do at the state and federal levels is require them to actually list the top 3 original source funders, not the name of the PAC, but the original source funders, the people who
Funders
actually put up the
provided
money.
the money to. Right.
So I have examples, but well, the GMO thing, for example.
Okay, and
I don't know if you want to go there.
let's talk about that for a minute, because there's I can see, positives and negatives, and I'm assuming the positives greatly outweigh the negatives with respect to letting people know who it was that funded something, because one of the potential issues is you become a target because you had voted for particular. That's one of the things why voting is anonymous, because I voted for this. I don't need to tell anybody.
Right.
I know, because this guy who was going to go the other way, I don't want him coming and
It's one
beating
vote.
me up.
It's one vote.
I understand that, but the point is that that anonymity
Yeah, yeah.
has value in that context. There was, and I think I made a note of it for one of the questions I wanted to ask you guys, because there was
I
an
remember.
example that who was this guy that Brendan Ike
Yes.
over at Mozilla.
Yeah.
He had
Right.
provided some money to something
remember.
multiple years ago.
Proposition 8.
Yeah,
The
several
the
years
anti-gay
ago,
marriage
and then he became president of Mozilla, and a big stink was back then he did this. Now, whether his perspective has changed or not was irrelevant. It
Right.
was that he had donated $1,000 to a cause that somebody didn't like, and therefore they got him booted out of being.
Right.
So how do you prevent that opposite side abuse?
I thought you'd never ask. So first of all, if all he gave was $1,000, then he'd be perfectly happy with the California Disclose Act, because
right.
you have to have given at least $10,000 for you to even be in the running to be one of the sources of the funds that gets listed. We're not interested in you, me, and the guy down the street who gives $20 or $100 or $500 to this ballot initiative or that candidate. What we're interested in is the big money. And so the rationale, I would, first of all the information that is showing up that would be disclosed directly to voters in the ad is available. It's just that you've got to be an investigative reporter with all kinds of time on your hand to go rooting through the Secretary of State's website and then dig down through the Department of Corporations to try to figure out who is really funding this PAC and where the money is really coming
So
from.
how would the Disclose Act provide easier access to that information?
It's going to be right on the screen. It's going to say right there at
The ad
bottom
itself would have to
the
have-
ad itself,
Would
right
have
at the
to
bottom
say
of the screen.
what?
So, for example, on a TV ad, the bottom third of the screen for the first 5 seconds would be black. It's always the same, so voters get used to the fact that if you want to know who's talking to you or who's pitching to you, just look at the black band at the bottom of the screen. It says top 3 funders of this ad are boom, 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 and it lists them right there. And they're original source funders again, not just the
Does
name
it
of the PAC.
give the amount?
No. But the viewer also can go to a website for further details on who else gave money and why. Now, on the issue of privacy, because I think that was a really important question. I think, again, relatively small donations like his Mr. Mozilla's, I know that's not his name.
Yeah.
But, his Ike, his donation of $1,000, of no consequence. We don't care about that. What we care about are the big donors. And it's really important for voters to know about where the big money is coming from. So I think the basic equation is it's kind of a sliding scale. The bigger the proportional influence that you want to have over the election, the the closer
Less
the closer you
anonymity.
get, the less anonymity you're entitled to. So if I want to give $100 to my favorite candidate, or I want to support this ballot initiative, or whatever, that's my business, and I should be able to do that privately and anonymously. As soon as I start wanting to have the hugely disproportionate influence over election that tens or millions, thousands of dollars do, the effect that has on controlling the message and so on, at that point, I think I'm obliged to tell voters who I am. Otherwise, if I'm that entity, I'm basically saying to you, or the viewer, I'm saying, I really want you to vote for this candidate or vote for this ballot measure, but I'm not going to tell you who I am.
So is the possibility of public funding potentially viable for ballot measures?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's a step down
One
the road.
of the things, I think
absolutely.
I sent out an email to everybody, an article that I read I thought was rather interesting, and we only have a couple minutes left here, but what it was talking about was the mobilization of individuals who are putting out small sums of money each, but when you get a like you were talking about who got elected as for whatever to go in and stop activities in Congress, there had to be a whole bunch of people that decided they wanted to vote for that person.
Right.
Okay, and so you get activist kind of possibilities even in small donations too. So I think the whole. There isn't an immediate solution, and like we've said before, there's no silver bullet, and we have to do this as an iterative process, it seems to me. But I like the amendment concept. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the disclose scenario presents some clear first salvos, shall we say, into being able to really deal with this.
And again, I fully support the Disclose Act and believe that it is the most effective first step and the most necessary one.
Right. Good. Well, gentlemen, we have an entire, right at this point, about 50 seconds left in the show. So I don't know that we have time for any. I think we've said a lot. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this show that we didn't cover in the last show, too. And I hope everybody gets the opportunity to watch both of these segments. This stuff is going to start airing very soon. And hopefully it'll have some impact on people's thought processes as we move into our election cycle that's coming up here very shortly. So,
and until we get money out of politics, I hope your viewers will consider going to those websites that they've seen for Eitan's organization and mine, and consider making whatever donation they can afford.
Nonprofit organizations, so that's okay. Good. Craig, Eitan, thank you so much for joining me here. I really appreciate it. And ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, send it to me here at info@referencepointtv.com. Check out the websites of all three folks that have been here today, and we'll see you next time on Reference Point.